The Lord will give you the desires of your heart, but understanding what that desire actually is, theologically, is very important to getting what you are after. And understanding that it's something that God put in you from the very beginning is equally important to understanding how to get what you're after, whether that be contentment, happiness, satisfaction, whatever the desire of your heart be. Understand that we don't understand that verse. That's the place to start. In getting into that, I would like to talk about my testimony, because my testimony does kind of wrap around that verse quite a bit. Because the desires of my heart in my youth was not what the desires of my adulthood would be. And once I learned that and understood that, I was able to come to the Lord a completely, radically different person. And I did have a itty bitty little tiny part of my life most people have never even heard about, where I did actually have a come to Jesus moment, a tiny bit of a faith crisis, and the way it was patched and how I got through that made me absolutely what I am today. To speak with me on my testimony, but not just my testimony, understanding how God can use you to do the most unthinkable things, right? The things that you fear, the things that you're like, don't use me for that. These testimonies are something that can speak to you. So I really hope you get a lot out of them. Welcome back to the Donna Howell Show, Brittney.
Thanks for having me. I can't wait to hear your testimony, because I've heard little bits of it on Simply His and on this show, but I'm excited to hear the full story.
From beginning to end, and it has a lot to do with the desires of your heart. There were some verses, growing up in church that you hear all the time, and that's one of them. The Lord will give you, it's almost like you hear it so much, and it's so often just barely peppered with the prosperity gospel, that you're kind of thinking that God can be your gimme celestial Santa Claus, the figure in the sky, who, as long as you say the right words and you attend church regularly, he's going to give you something.
Right.
All right. And then you learn, when you get older, the desire was always there, but you had to mature into it for you to even understand what it was, and then understand that God gave you a desire that is based on how you're going to serve him, because it is only when you serve him that the ultimate supreme satisfaction can be found. Whoa. And then once you see it, you can't unsee it, and you're like, oh, the pathetic, petty things I asked for all these years. Not that any prayer, whether it be a request or otherwise, is ever petty in the eyes of God. But we ourselves can look back at some of our childhood prayers.
It's embarrassing
and go,
almost.
It's embarrassing. What was I asking for?
You're like, I understand why God didn't answer that, because I see the outcome. And he's like, no, just listen to me. I know what's best for you.
Yes. So, okay. It actually all started for years and years and years and years. I saw my father entering this kind of a public ministry. He was becoming a public persona. He was becoming the Dr. Thomas Horn. Even before he had his doctorate, he became an itinerant speaker after years and years of being a home preacher. And when he was traveling around, I saw the lines of people that were in lines really long, because they just could not wait to meet this guy, Tom Horn, that they had heard about. That was what it was like to be Tom's daughter on the West Coast, back in the Oregon, Washington area. And I just remember that when he started going on radio and television and the 700 Club, and he was being featured all over, even in some cases, secular media were featuring him, that I remember thinking, God, please, anything but that for me. Not because I wasn't proud of my daddy. Oh, was I proud of my daddy, but I didn't want that for me. I don't like attention. I don't like being the central speaker. I don't like having all eyes on me. I really like privacy and anonymity. I like to be left alone. It's funny the number of people that assume that, like, when I go to a conference or I get invited to speak somewhere or whatever, I'll come out, hi, everybody, and I'll do my thing. And then immediately I just disappear. Right. And I always hear from people later, I looked and looked for you. And it's like, I'm sorry, I don't have a social battery. Like, God did not gift me with a social battery. So it's tapped dry before I even walked into the building.
Right.
I like to be left alone. I married a man who loves to be left alone.
And Joe's a little bit like this too. Like,
yes.
it's not that he doesn't love talking to people, but you just get a little burnt out sometimes, and you just want to go home and be in your own space with your own family and just silence.
Well, you know how this is something that almost everybody will understand. You know, when you're sick physically, like you have the flu, you do not want to be at a hotel or in public. You want to be home, your own toilet, your own bed,
your own food and drinks and medicine and everything you like and how you like it.
Yeah. So for somebody who's more of a social introvert like me, which I know a lot of people would not assume that because I talk a lot and I talk fast and I have my own show and I'm out there. Boy, I really am an introvert. It's ironic. This weird life that I'm living is so weird. But it's also interestingly, I think, exactly where God wants me right now. And that's part of my testimony. So my dad, he's out and he's making his face appear all over everything. And he was the same way, by the way. He used to come home and go, I am exhausted. I don't want to look at a human being for 3 days. Yeah. He'd go into the back room and he would read his Bible and he would practice preach. We could hear him in the other room. He was always whisper preaching and practicing behind the doors.
That's sweet.
He never said a word behind the pulpit until he had practiced and put a lot of prayer and research and time into everything he said. And his preaching is incredible. To this day, it's still... We had to go watch the Rescue Us docuseries the other day for just one final review through before it got sent off to the duplicators and became, released. And there was a clip of my father preaching, and it reminded me of those days. And that all of the publicity and everything that I grew up with, you'd think I would... be an up-and-coming mini Tom and be wanting to be like Daddy, but it really wasn't that. What started off was he originally told me I was 12. And he was like, Donna, come here. I want to ask you something. I got this book I'm writing, and I need you to write me 2 or 3 pages of it because I have written it. It's just garbage, but you're good at writing. I mean, even at 12, he thought that I was good at writing. And he's like, here's all my research. You don't even have to research it. Just take these things I'm trying to say and make it look good. And so I went in the back room and I came back 2 days later and I'm like, here you go. Does this work? It ended up in, I can't remember now, I think it was Spiritual Warfare, The Invisible Invasion, his very first book ever. It was one of his very earliest books. And he was like, this is what you were born for. You are a writer. And so the more he became kind of a public face or whatever, the more he started wanting to pull me into it. And he was like, hey, write more for me. I had no problem writing.
Right.
I loved it. I'm like, Dad, give me that. I will do that anytime. But then I started getting a little older and he wanted me to also be on shows with him. And I was like, nope, I draw the line there. And then me, in my foolish humanity and in my flesh, I said the stupidest thing you could ever say when God is listening, which is, mark my words, Dad, I will never. And here I am. So I'm doing the thing I said I was never going to do. But it started off with me begging for anonymity and privacy, even as a kid. Even when I was out socializing in youth group, it was like, okay, I did we did the hot dog roast. I'm ready for everybody to leave me alone and go home. And I started a prayer very young based on the idea of the how all of the body parts that make up the body of Christ and Paul's teaching on that. If all of the people who were Christians, I'm modernizing this a bit here, but if all of the people who are Christians were to be the eye of the body, then the body of Christ would amount to a giant eyeball. Where would be the ears or the hearing?
Right. You want to be a full person.
Correct. And so if we're going to be the body of Christ, we need to take into consideration what body part we might be and how that might function in our giftings. And so me and my bright young arrogance, thinking I knew everything, I had decided that I was going to be this particular body part. I prayed and prayed and prayed about it. And I was like, God, I know which one I want to be. Make me the appendix. Is that not ridiculous? There was a couple of really good reasons, though. The first one is because nobody knows what the appendix does. So I got to be mysterious. Yeah. I just kind of float around and do whatever I want.
You do something, but it's not always paid attention to.
Yeah, nobody thinks about it. Nobody thinks about it, right. But the other thing is that if it bursts, you go in for a quick surgery, the body continues to function.
Right.
So I thought, worst case scenario, I fail miserably at whatever it is God's asking me to do. And I was the appendix and nobody even cares because I was never noticed in the first place. Like, that's what I wanted. I wanted to be in a back room left alone. And that went on and on and on. Well, finally, over so many years of Dad coming back over and over and over again and explaining to me how it could be an opportunity from God, or you're not even going to pray about it, like he was a very convicting man.
Right.
You're not going to tell Tom no and then just put a period there. You have to say no and then explain why you're coming to this conclusion. And for me, I ran out of excuses, and eventually I said, okay, but just this one book. So help me God, this one book. I'll never do it again.
If you look behind me, there's a stack of just one book that turned into
that's like only a few of them that I've written. Yeah. So Dad asked me to do this one particular interview with a friend of his, and this interviewer had told me he's going to ask me for my testimony from the beginning of the interview forward. And I was like, ruh-roh, because I mean, what do I say? I grew up in church. Like,
Right.
I sincerely gave my heart to the Lord at an age that is so young, I don't even remember. Listen, I'm not making fun of any particular kind of testimony. The people who have these testimonies where they backslid and they did drugs, or they ended up in prison, or they did all of these things, and then they came to know the Lord. These are powerful testimonies. I dare you to say that they are not powerful testimonies.
Right.
They're wonderful and they're glorious, but they're not mine. I never had that season.
Right.
My own searching was not that. And so here I was, tra-la-la, I'm supposed to tell my testimony, and it was pretty superficial. I basically said, well, I gave my heart to the Lord. I don't know, I was 4 or 5, and I've never left him since. Ding! Like, that was all I had to say. And it was really superficial and kind of sad. And I came to my dad and I was like, I don't know what to do with this, Dad. I mean, I'm in my late teens. I'm starting to look for a husband. Like, I'm not sure what I should do with this. But if anybody ever asks me for my testimony again, I can't do that. That's just lame. And he goes, no, stop. That's what the world is telling you. But he said, that's actually a very powerful testimony, that you gave your heart to the Lord and you never fell away. Oh, that we could all just stay faithful.
Right.
And Dad knows some of the weird stuff that I went through. I had a rough patch. I'm not quite ready to tell the details on this part of my life yet, but when I was at that youth camp that we ministered at for several years, I had what I bet you anything would have been a clinical case of cabin fever. Mm-hmm. I literally lived in a cabin in the woods. It sounds cliche, but it literally was a cabin in the woods where there was snow, 5 to 8 feet of snow, 9 months out of the year up there. So we would have a blistering nosebleed summer, just hot, fry an egg on the pavement levels of hot summer. And then blink overnight, it was 7 to 8 feet of snow. Yeah. And there was no in between. And it was that for 9 months. And you were constantly snowed into your house. I remember there were moments where I would try to leave my house and my front door wouldn't open. And I had to unlock it and wiggle it just open enough. And then I had to stand back and just thrust kick it open with my foot to just get the door to open. And
so you could shovel or do whatever.
So that you could get the shovel through the front door so you could whittle your way out. And then when you finally got to your car, you had to take, one of those big, like brooms handle sized ice picker scraper things. Yeah, scrape that all off and shovel your car out, and then you had to break the door open. It was just like an all day thing going
and
anywhere.
And then if you could even get down the road.
Yes.
With conditions like that.
And everybody was married but me. Allie and them were married. Joe was married. Mom and Dad were married. Everybody had a companion, and I was completely and totally alone. Funny enough, if you watch a lot of our programming, you will have at some point seen Jamie Woodle in some of our health programs.
Yeah, she was my roommate. To Eden. Wow.
She was my roommate for a couple of those years, but not always. And I was up there for a number of years in my late teens through some of the darkest times, because it was a spiritual warfare heavy location. Teenagers would come from all over the state, and they would go into this chapel that was there, and they would radically give their hearts to the Lord, turn their hearts over to God, get their life back on track, and then the next day they were gone. So there was just droves, hundreds of people praising the Lord, and then silence, not even crickets. Yeah. It was just silence.
Kind of
eerie, yes. And I had no friends. And I had a lot of people that would come up to the camp and they would do the whole I'll be your friend thing. But then I would, at the time, the texting didn't exist yet. So they would give me phone numbers, emails. They never stayed in touch. And God bless them. I don't blame them. I probably wouldn't have stayed in touch with some lonely girl up at a camp somewhere either. But I didn't have anyone to talk to, period, except my family. And they were always in the evenings
doing things with their kids and families.
Right. So I was by myself for years up in the loneliest place where I was trapped inside a house and I couldn't leave, and I had nightmares all night, every night. It was a very dark time. Now, the deeper part of that, maybe someday I will give, but it goes into all kinds of supernatural, whoa type stuff that I don't feel is necessary for today's show. But that was a very, very crazy dark time. Some of the faith struggle that I came up with at the time was learning to rely on God, and I did, and I never fell away from God. There were times I struggled with understanding him and times I was trying to figure out my own identity in him, but I never fell away from God. So Dad reconvinced me. He's like, no, you don't understand. For what you've been through, you never had a moment where you ran out into the middle of the snow and cursed God and shook your fist at the heavens and said, I'm done. That's a powerful faith.
Right.
And he was right. And then I was proud of it. That was right after that. Right after I had finally said, okay, I understand my faith testimony, that my faith had a little bit of a crisis. But again, it wasn't because of God. It was because of what church said God was. So my faith crisis, to collapse it and give the short version, I was in the orange room, thus named because it was literally orange. My favorite color, orange. Orange was everywhere. And I was in the orange room, which was my office a couple houses ago. And I was praying. And I'm like, Lord, I do believe you are there. And I do believe that you are who you say you are. But I don't feel like I know you. And I feel like I've spent my entire life so far trying to figure out who you are. And I hear from this preacher over there that you're like this, and this preacher over there teaches that. It's incongruent. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't flow. I'm stuck feeling like no matter how long and how hard I search for you, the only thing I'm left with at the end of the day is a question mark. But I promise you, I will keep looking. And I meant it when I said it. And I will keep seeking. Okay, so this was another one of those weird moments. I do a lot of typing on Microsoft Word. So it was like in my mind's eye, literally. This is not like I'm saying it was kind of like this. It was literally in my mind's eye. It was a Microsoft Word document had opened up, and the blinking cursor was there. And it was like a sentence typed itself out really, really, really fast. This has happened a couple of times. So I have a couple testimonies floating around about this Microsoft Word thing that's just something that I feel like the Lord has allowed me to see a couple of times. This sentence appeared and it said, the reason why you are struggling believing in the Jesus you've heard about is because the Jesus that you've heard about, in all caps, does not exist. But I told my husband about that. I was married at the time, and I told my husband about that. And I was like, the Jesus that I have been taught does not exist. I know they're not talking about my dad. I know that this Microsoft Word in my head is not talking about any one particular teaching. What does this mean? That's when I started studying Greek and Hebrew. Oh my gosh, did I fall in love with the Bible at that moment. And something shifted within me. I was no longer a lifestyle Christian at that point. It became a personal, every single day, gotta figure out what that next word means.
Right.
I would hear somebody drop a verse. John 3:16, doesn't matter, whatever it is. Somebody would drop a verse and I would be, what does that mean in Hebrew? What does that mean in Greek? Occasionally Aramaic, but what does that mean? And I was going back to the original languages. And when I started realizing that the Christianese we speak on the daily in church today is not at all what and who Jesus was 2,000 years ago, what and who Yahweh was since time immemorial. Oh my gosh, I absolutely fell in love with it because suddenly all of these things, the contradictions of the Bible, they don't exist. The Bible does not contradict itself.
Right.
But you struggle with that in the beginning because the English translations, they really look like they do. So I got to digging into that. And suddenly, around about the same time, I fell on my knees, literally, in the orange room. My husband was there. And I just remember praying desperately, God, you are not who I thought you were. You are not the God that they preach about in church. They're getting some major things wrong here. I can't wait to write a book about this. I can't wait to tell people about this. Suddenly, the message that I had felt like was in me just kind of scattered into the winds and I couldn't get it out of me fast enough. But nobody was going to do the TV and the radio and all of those things except for the appendix. right?
Yeah, you couldn't have
Because
somebody else speak on your behalf.
I tried.
Yeah.
I really did.
You weren't Moses, you were Aaron.
I so tried. So much of my story, Brittney, is here am I, send Aaron. So much of my story was here am I, send Aaron. And then one day when I realized I was going to have to do all of my own speaking for myself, what did I find? And a couple times I even did. I would write something and surrender it to someone else and say, now get this word out there. And they weren't passionate about it. It wasn't their thing.
Right.
They didn't figure that out. They didn't know why it was so important. And when they did try to deliver it for me, they didn't get to the punchline was missing. It was like they would share a couple interesting thoughts and then boom, done. It was failing. And so I went and I started to pray, okay, Lord, if you don't want me to be the appendix, then you've got to tell me, what am I, a mouth? Like, what am I? Well, again, the prompting, not Microsoft Word prompting this time, just prompting. I was sitting in the orange room and I felt like I needed to look up the appendix because this is what I had prayed to be. Oh my goodness. All of the science had changed because when I first started praying to be the appendix, the science was out and it said, it's just this thing that the evolutionary natural selection process is kind of held on to. It doesn't really do anything. Nobody knows what it does.
Yeah.
It's just
when
this
we were
useless
cavemen,
body
we
part.
needed it for something and now we don't need it.
Right, exactly. The science changed, but I hadn't been keeping up with it. I'd just been using the word appendix in my prayers and then one day I looked it up. What does the appendix do for the body? Oh my gosh. There was one headline after another. The appendix is no longer a useless organ, science says. The appendix, far more important to the body than scientists of yesterday realized, science says. I mean, it was just one headline after another after another. I was reading these articles, and as it turns out, it's a kind of filtering system. I mean, they would not call it a filter in every case, but it's a kind of filtering system in that when you put something into your body that isn't right, it's one of the major filtering systems that recognizes it and brings you back to health, brings you back to what your body is supposed to be doing. And I thought, okay, so the spiritual side of that is that I would be seeing people dropping verses left and right, preaching this theology that I don't agree with. It's just simply not what the Bible says. And the appendix of the body is going to swoop in and go, wait a minute, what is this? I sense something coming into the body that isn't supposed to be there. Medicinally, how do I kick it out? Let's look at the Greek word. Let's look at the Hebrew word. Let's look at what that actually really means. What does that verse really mean? And then get it in there and flush out the nonsense. And lo and behold, it was like the Holy Spirit said, you asked for it.
You are the appendix, right?
You are the appendix. But I mean, how ironic that it would be so personal. It wouldn't just be, no, you're the mouth. You were wrong. You were praying to be the appendix. That's what you wanted. The desire of my heart was there all along. Now I just had to get over myself and be willing to do a few things that were really uncomfortable. So again, go back to Daddy. What do I do, Dad? And his response was very short, but very powerful, and it has stuck with me forever. No prophet in any part of the Bible ever was a prophet because they liked it or they wanted to be.
Right.
They went through hell on earth to bring the word of God to people, and the people rejected them. The people put them through hell. They prosecuted them in every imaginable way. The prophets were oftentimes very hated people, and very few people in the midst of them would listen to them. Sure, we've got judges, and we've got a few moments in the Old Testament where a powerful, judge or prophet comes forward and says these things. But Dad said, if you use the prophets as an example of what God might be doing with you, not that I'm a prophet, dear Lord, not that I'm a prophet, but that no person has ever been able to fully and completely serve the Lord without discomfort in some way or other, because, honey, it's not about you.
Well, Esther, the story of Esther, she got sent to this foreign land and had to speak up to her husband, which at that time, you didn't speak up to your husband, let alone your husband who happens to be the king. But when she did, he ended up listening and realizing that what she was saying was true. But yeah, no, I can see that. It wasn't just the prophets. It's all these other people throughout the Bible too. Always uncomfortable. Jonah literally tried to run from God. How did that turn out?
Yeah, no, over and over and over again. And it's never comfortable and happy and easy. There are moments where it's very fulfilling. Let me give you an example. I was in the green room at the Jim Bakker show one time, speaking to Jim Bakker. And I said, it's an awful shame what a lot of people think, that the Lord giving you the desire of your heart and you being in ministry, that you're going to find this niche place that you're just 100% happy and perfect in, that it's perfectly you and it's perfectly comfortable. And I said, if you are not uncomfortable in some way or other in what you've called to do, you're probably doing it wrong. And Jim's first response was, well, that's not true. I'm very happy and comfortable in what I'm doing. I love what I do. And I said, okay, but hang on. Have you ever tried to go into we're talking about the Jim Bakker here.
Right.
Biggest name in Christian history for a long time. I said, have you ever had a time where you just want to go get a steak with the wife and you can't even find a restaurant you can walk into without hordes of people? Are you Jim Bakker? Are you Jim Bakker? And he's like, oh, I hate that. Sometimes I want privacy.
Yeah.
I'm like, there you go. That's only one. And then we started rapping. And after that, it was like, oh, yeah, there's this that's uncomfortable and there's that's exhausting and all these different things. But you do it. It's hard, but you stick with it and you do it. So here's one of the bottom lines on this episode about testimonies, personal testimonies, is that if you're 100% happy and you're not challenged and you're not uncomfortable in any way with what you are doing for the Lord, you're probably not doing what you're supposed to be doing. I am not saying that you are supposed to be miserable.
Right.
Please understand the balance here. What I'm saying is that if you are fully operating in the calling that has been placed on your life within the desires of your heart as ordained by God, you are going to experience discomfort, challenge, persecution. The righteous will be persecuted. You will face that, and you're going to doubt yourself. You're going to sit there at some point and go, well, I can write, but I can't be on TV. And look at you now. This isn't about how wonderful and great Donna is. If anything, I am, the Hugh Jackman movie, Greatest Showman?
Mm-hmm. The musical.
I identify with the character who is the historical bearded lady, Letty. She, fully female, just grows a beard. And she's heavyset, and she's based on a true historical character. And we now understand this to be a hormonal imbalance, but at the time, they were circus freaks.
Yeah,
they were considered circus freaks. And so for years, Lord, I don't want to wear makeup. I don't want to wear dresses. I'm not ever going to wear high heels. I don't like hairspray. I'm not going to do the thing where my face is up on everything. I don't want to be the spokesperson. Please, Lord, please deliver me from this. How can I be anything but this thing? And then I watched that movie, and it was like in the very first few minutes of that movie, it was kind of like the Holy Spirit said, hey, watch this. And I was like, okay. And when she became the leader of the freaks, I was like, okay, it touched me very, very deeply, because I realized that this is not about how great Donna is. This is about how Donna the nerd still feels like Donna the nerd. I still feel misplaced, out of place. I still feel like the bearded lady, the circus freak, the weirdo. I still feel like, how in the world am I in this position? How do I have my own studio, my own show? How am I on Skywatch Weekly? This ain't me. I still feel that all the time. People think I've gotten over it because I am very, very good at exuding confidence in this chair. But it's really not how I feel. Every day I battle. I'm not comfortable in this chair. I wish I could, be anonymous, But at the end of the day, boy, when I get to rapping about it and I get passionate about something and I've discovered something about the Bible that the rest of the world has largely forgotten for thousands of years, I get so excited and I get on that panel on Skywatch television and I get to really nailing it and driving it home. And when it's over, I'm sitting there and I'm almost shaking from the adrenaline. And I'm going, look what the appendix did. Through the power of God alone, not me. Look what the appendix did. And so I want, as cliche as it sounds, I want to make sure that people listening to me hear me say, you might feel like the circus freak or the bearded lady, but when you get to the fullness of the fruition of what God has called you to do, when it finally unlocks in your spirit and the Holy Spirit unlocks that movement in you, it's going to be bigger than you. It ain't about you. It's going to be bigger than you. And there will be people in heaven who got there as a result of the things you have done and said. And that is worth being uncomfortable for.
Right. Wow, Donna, that your testimony is really powerful, and you've told a little bit of it on Simply His, and I know the comments on that video, there was people who felt the same way as you, like, I don't like doing this, I don't like doing that, but I'm in the grocery store and God pushes on my shoulder, hey, talk to that woman. And you're like, I don't want to talk to her. She's going to think I'm weird. Like, I've seen that comment a lot. And you don't always have to be on a big platform to be used by God. There's people all over the world. You're in a grocery store, you're at the park, you're in school PTA meeting, and that's when God tells you to do something, and you have to either obey or not. And sometimes you don't know the fruit of what comes out of that. In my case, my testimony is a little different, but I did grow up a pastor's kid like you. Fun fact, I was born in October, and so I was a bald baby, and around the time the church was doing a Christmas play, and I was the only baby born at that time that was small enough, and so I actually played baby Jesus. People, when did you get saved? I'm like, well, I was baby Jesus in the church play, so it's been a long time. And then growing up, they always put on a big production. I was an angel at one point. I was a random person watching Jesus be crucified who was also my uncle playing Jesus. So my whole family was in this church play, and they actually were really fun. I always looked forward to them. I had a great childhood. My parents were great people and great influences on me. But whenever I got to be a little bit older, around 12, 13, I started to go through a rough patch, kind of what you were explaining. My family had experienced a really tragic loss of my uncle, like a sudden. He wasn't old, there wasn't anything, and I won't go into how he passed away because I don't want to share things that my cousins might not be comfortable with, but he passed away tragically, and that was a really hard time in our whole family. My mom lost her brother, my aunt lost her brother. It happened during Thanksgiving, so it was a really, right after the holidays, all these good memories, and it just like flipped on its head, and we're having to figure out what to do. And so that was like kind of a catalyst in feeling shaken. My cousin and I were best friends growing up. He's only 3 months older than me, and he actually shares the same birthday as my husband. So we all grew up together. It was a very close-knit family. And when that happened, understandably, me and him kind of drifted apart. He had to, switch schools because of this tragedy. They had to move around a lot. And me and my cousin, who had lost his father, both going through puberty at the same time, experiencing a lot of emotions from that event. So it was a rough patch already. And this was also the time in pop culture when the social media, Tumblr, was a really big social media. And a lot of people might not know what this is, but Tumblr was a blog type of place where people could post pictures, posts. Tumblr quickly did turn into a very dark website where it was people posting things promoting like eating, self-depression, all these kind of things, but almost glamorizing it. Like you were this special person if you experienced these really hard things. And being a very impressionable 12, 13-year-old, everybody's talking about Tumblr, everybody's on Tumblr. Instagram had those kind of little sects too. And I kind of got sucked up into that whole thing. And I did identify back then as emo. I had the emo hair, I had black and pink hair, bang swoop. I wore all black, and that whole kind of persona did start to take over how I felt. I started suffering from depression, and I actually did start self-harming because that was really popular on these websites, and a lot of people at school were also self-harming. And I started to fall into the kind of music that promoted that, and it kind of became my whole world.
I almost remember back in like just after the Nirvana days and Green Day type days, that there was like a whole community of young people that it was almost a competition to see who could be the most broken and the most dark.
Yeah, no, it was similar to that. There was a lot of famous singers who would post these or have these kind of very depressive quotes. And that's why I'm very passionate. A few weeks ago, we did a thing on demonic music because I really do think it does have an influence on you, whether you are cognizant of it or not. If you're listening to these kind of songs that are promoting things like suicide and depression and explicit self, it's going to start to manifest in your brain because I wasn't guarding myself against that kind of thing. So I did harm. And it got to a point where I was extremely depressed, and my parents got really concerned about me, as any parents would. And they had to get me some help with that area. They brought me to my dad's very close friend who's a pastor and did some kind of counseling with her. And I did start to get a little bit better, but I was still kind of like, I didn't fully want to give this thing up to God. I didn't want to fully give up the harm thing. And it really did become like an addiction. You know, I'd have to wear long sleeves in the summer, never wear shorts type of thing. And my parents did eventually find out about it, obviously. It's kind of hard to hide that kind of stuff from your family who's with you all the time. And after they had prayed for me, I stopped doing it as much, but I would still kind of do it every once in a while. Later on, when I turned around 15, I got invited to a pastor's kids retreat in Arizona. And, you know, my dad was never the head pastor of a church. He was always like an associate pastor. But for some reason that year, they sent my dad an invitation in his email and said, you know, your daughter can come to this. It's for kids 12 to 18. It's like a fun weekend retreat. And he asked me if I wanted to go. And I was like, sure, like that sounds fun. I was kind of nervous because in a lot of these church circles, everybody whose parents are pastors are really close and know each other because they go to conferences and all this stuff. But I didn't go to any of that stuff. So I didn't know anybody at this conference. And funny enough, my husband Dakota's cousin was actually at that conference, and this was before we started dating, but I did grow up with him a little bit. So I was like, okay, at least I know one person. It was a really fun weekend, and it got to the last night, and what they would basically do is it was almost like kids camp where, you know, we would have church service in the morning, and then we'd go do some fun stuff during the day, and then at night have another church service. And it was the final church service of this weekend, and they had this message, which I think was actually really powerful. It was, you know, being pastors' kids, being in ministry, you're always having to sacrifice for others, having to work all the church events. You have to be in the play. You have to do all these things because who else is going to do it? And they said, we want to take this night and flip it over. We want to pray for you guys and let you come to the altar and kind of just let it all out, you know, because a lot of pastors' kids are afraid, you know, I'm not supposed to have sin or be bad because I'm supposed to be this example. And it's not even that your parents necessarily are the ones putting that on you. You just kind of, you know, you don't want to make your parents look bad or your church look bad.
Well, and I'll add really quickly, sometimes it has nothing to do with the parents. Like with my mom and dad, that they never did the whole, here's how you should be and you're going to make God mad. And they raised me, they told me what the rules were and expected me to follow them. But honestly, the it takes a village mindset is very heavily prevalent in churches when it comes to PKs. Pastors' kids, a lot of people just assumed that their opinion was going to be something that I need to live by, and that my mom and dad were going to say, you know, thumbs up, Sister Nancy, thanks for teaching my kids the ways of the Lord. But when it wasn't the ways of the Lord and it was just a mere opinion, mom and dad would pull me aside later and say, don't listen to Nancy, do it this way.
Right. No, I had that kind of thing too. You know, my parents let me start wearing makeup at like 12. I was wearing mascara and eyeliner. And there was a church lady who came up to me and kind of made me feel really bad for wearing makeup. And that was like really embarrassing for me, you know, to be pulled aside. Because I'm like, I'm not usually the person that gets pulled aside. And my parents bought me this makeup. They allowed me to do this. And I had the same conversation with my parents. They're like, it's okay for her to say that, but that's not how we're choosing to raise you. You're allowed to wear makeup, you know. They approved what I wore to church that day.
There's a lot of pressure on PKs.
Right, there is. And
so that's cool that they had you guys come forward.
Yeah,
like that.
I could see like the whole atmosphere in the room. Everybody's like, oh, now the spotlight really is on you. And you do have the opportunity to be real. We're all PKs. Who's going to judge us? We're all in the same boat, you know. And so they did an altar call. And I went up to she was a young adult, but she wasn't like a part of the PK thing. She was just working there. And I just asked her to pray for me. And she was like, is there anything specific? And I was really shy about what I'd been going through. So I didn't want to tell her, you know, this whole self-harm and depression kind of thing. And so I just said, can you just pray for me? I don't think she knew what was going on because she really didn't seem like she did, but she was praying over me. And at the end of it, she said, I really feel like God's putting this message on my heart that I have to tell you. And she's like, I don't know what it means, but you probably do. And she was like, you have to let go of this thing. God already healed you from it, and you have to decide to let it go. And I was like, okay, yeah. He spoke to her, because it was like this thing where I'm like, I don't want, it was embarrassing. It was a shame that I had all my life. And I don't know why it wasn't so shameful that I wanted to let it go, but I just kind of wanted to keep it. It was my thing that I struggled with, and I'm trying to get better, but she was like, you're already healed from it. You have to choose to walk in that healing. And so I go home that night and I'm like, wow, like it really spoke to me. Funny enough, that summer I had already been planning on going on this missions trip to Russia. And the pastor who had prayed for me actually was one of the pastors going on this trip. So she knew what I was struggling with, and she never treated me any different. And while I was there, we actually worked at, it was called a restoration house, which is where they brought in all these orphans that lived in Russia who aged out of their like kind of foster care orphanage system, and would allow them to live until they could get on their feet. Because in Russia, it was like the second you're 18, you're out. You don't have a chance to try to find a job. You might still be in high school, but you got to go. And so they would bring all these kids together and try to help them, find jobs, and also teach and preach the gospel of God to them. I really got to see, all these depressive thoughts, suicidal thoughts, self-harm things that I was doing. If I had gone through with those thoughts I had, I wouldn't have been able to go on this missions trip. And it really did change my life, praying for these kids who had a way harder life than me. There was a kid, he was like the same age as me, and he had actually been a refugee from Ukraine. He'd lost his everything, his house, his parents had to send him on a train to Russia. I honestly don't know how he got there, but I'm like, okay, I need to realize that there is a lot worse out there. And not that it's this big competition, who has it worse, but while I was there, there was a language barrier, but I was praying for people, and they actually did a night where it's like, does anybody want to share their testimony? And this was kind of a new testimony, like it'd only been a few months since I had experienced that. I felt this like tap on my shoulder, like, you need to go up there and tell your testimony. And I was like, not like a physical person, but God, telling me like, you should share your testimony. And so it was really nerve-wracking for me at 15. Like I said, it's only been a few months to share my testimony. And there was a translator up there who was translating to Russian for all the people who'd spoke Russian. And I'm not exactly sure what happened from that, because I only went to Russia one time. But I could feel, a lot of people came up after me, gave me hugs, and I hope that it touched somebody. And I'm sure it did. I wasn't the only kid struggling with those kind of thoughts. And then a little bit later on, this year was like very formidable for me. I was very lonely. Not that I didn't have friends, but I just was lonely. Kind of like what you were saying, I felt kind of isolated. I was like one of the only Christian kids at my school. I always was asking God, send me somebody, send me somebody. On a random October evening, I get this text message on Facebook, actually, from my husband, Dakota, just asking me how I was doing. And I hadn't talked to him since I was like maybe 11, 12 at like a birthday party for his sister. So even though we grew up together, I had moved away to a different town. And so we kind of lost contact, but I always did have a crush on him. In first grade, my mom was giving birth to my sister, and I actually got to stay at his house. And I was like, oh my gosh, I've been staying at my crush's house. I'm in first grade, it's like super innocent, but
and then how old were you when you got the Facebook hello from him?
I was 15, almost 16. Even whenever we were little, his mom's like trying to get me to play with his sister because she was closer in age than me. But I was like, I just want to play with Dakota. Like, he had all the video games. His room was like so cool, and he had all the scooters and everything. And she's like, no, you got to sleep in her room at least, I was like, okay. And so I had this crush on him. Again, I saw him when I was like 11, still thought he was really cool, but I figured, this won't work out. We live like 2 hours from each other. How could we date or whatever? And I was still really young. And so I get this text message from him, and like the rest is seriously history, like God worked it out for good, because we had begun just talking to each other, kind of getting to know each other again. And his grandpa is the pastor of a church that we grew up in, and they were going on vacation or something and needed somebody to come preach at the church while they were gone. And so they invited my dad. And this was the first time my dad got invited to go to our like home church and preach. And so I was like, yes, I'm going to get to see him, because he wasn't going on this vacation with them. And so we go to church, and after church we go to lunch. And I think my dad could kind of tell, like, why are you like all on Dakota, like have you guys been talking? And I'm like, yeah, we just text sometimes, like whatever.
Playing it down.
And his mom actually came to lunch with us, and my birthday was coming up in a few weeks. And she was like, if it's okay with me, she was like, Dakota and his sister could come down for your birthday party and hang out. Because we're all kind of like reconnecting after this like blip of time where we all were apart. And so I was like, yeah, like they can come to my birthday party. Like that would be awesome. And from that point on, we started dating and then got engaged at 18, and we've been married for 6 years, almost together for 10 years. Next year will be 10 years. But the reason I brought that whole story up is because God knew my heart and how lonely I was. I had opened up about my struggles to Dakota, and I still was kind of doing some harm things. Like it was more sporadic, but he was like, I don't want you to do those things. You need to stop doing them. And I was like, okay, this is somebody that, I'm falling in love with, and I respect him. And I was like, okay. And honestly, after he told me that, I never did it again.
Wow.
It's been, like I said, we've almost been together 10 years. So it's almost been 10 years. And God has shown me, there's a reason I kept you here and why I don't want you to do that. And yeah, that's my testimony. And I just want to say, a lot of young girls and boys struggle with things like self-harm, eating disorders, depression, and a lot of pop culture does kind of promote that. And you can break the mold and not follow through with those things. It is important to get help and to open up to somebody you can trust so that you can start getting the help you need.
I think being able to be empowered to reach out in the first place is very important, because a lot of people literally think, well, who would I talk to?
Right.
In the same way that you felt that way. I was very lucky that I had the family that I did. I did have, they were all very, very innocent. My relationships prior to my husband, they were all very innocent. I believed in abstinence until marriage. There was funny how God kind of brings the right one.
Yeah.
So funny. I don't have time to get into the long version of the story, but I will tell you that I was driving a lunch truck and serving lunch to these guys on my lunch truck route when I met my husband. And long story short, I was so attracted to him so immediately, and that was very unusual for me. Because I was a little bit Brad Pitt, that don't impress me much, with my whole just looking at different guys. I'm like, whatever, who wants to talk theology? So it was just...
First day, let's get into the etymology.
Yeah. There was. And really, there was only one guy that I could really have those kinds of conversations with, and he was getting married to my best friend. And he's actually been on the show before, Jeremy Mitchell. And he and I, it's funny, I was so open about this. Otherwise, I would not throw him under the bus, but we even had a good laugh about it on this show. We did not get along in the beginning because he and I had very different theological views. So even then, when you're praying for a spouse, sometimes you still don't even know what to pray for. But I do remember that I was making theology nerd jokes on the lunch truck. And James, my now husband, he got it, he understood it, and he flung it right back at me. And I was like, hot, wow.
You're like, hold on, I need to talk to this guy about his order.
It was hard.
We need your phone number to give you the sandwich.
It was pretty difficult. It was pretty difficult to focus on my job there for a few days. And also he was super shy, and I knew he wasn't going to be one of these guys that I could right in the middle of all in front of all of his work friends or whatever say, let's trade numbers or whatever. I knew it wasn't going to go well if I did that at all. So I actually took a DVD that we had been talking about DVDs or whatever. And I took a DVD and I pulled the DVD out and I wrote my phone number with coffee sometime on there. And I put it behind the DVD. Then I popped the DVD back on and clamped it so that even if he went into his work and opened the DVD in front of his friends, it wouldn't just pop out. Yeah, well, he got home and then he never called, and I was like, dang, I guess he's not interested. And then the next day he came out for his usual sandwich, and he goes, there was a special feature on that DVD?
My gosh.
I said, yes, the director intended for you to find
the
that.
director's cut.
Yes, that was the code we were talking in. And he's like, just wanted to make sure that I was understanding that correctly.
James
and then he called me that evening. So the only reason he didn't call me was because he didn't know, was that accidentally meant for someone
That's
else?
so James, to get your permission to go through with it. That's sweet. Yeah.
Yeah. I couldn't be happier. And not, from what I can observe with you and Dakota, you guys are made to be together. And it's cool because God really does like use people and speaks through people and gets us the message. And I'm hoping that we've done that for somebody who is tuning in now. I hope one of our testimonies or both together has been able to reach through the screen, through your earbuds or however you're taking in this content today, and be able to really, truly apply to your own life some kind of a lesson that can encourage you and inspire you just to be that much closer to trusting God in what He has planned, because it is sometimes not at all what you expect.
Right.
You can be this close. You can be the appendix the entire time and be praying to be the appendix. And the whole time you're the appendix, you keep on expecting God's going to send you the Aaron. And I'm not comparing myself to Moses, but, in comparing to the narrative of simply being your own mouthpiece. And then one day you wake up and realize, oh, yep, this is what I got to do. And it isn't going to be comfortable and it's not always going to be fun, but oh my goodness, the reward.
Right.
There is nothing like going home at the end of a good day when you can say that day, whatever I did that day was what God called me to do, and I'm operating in it.
And I think the common theme between our testimonies, even though they're very different, is you have to fully surrender your life to God. You had to surrender what you wanted to do with your life to God. And once you did, all these doors opened up. I had to surrender this addiction, this depression and anxiety and all these things to God. And it changed my life forever. And it doesn't mean you don't have struggles. It doesn't mean there's never negative voices in your ear telling you maybe this isn't what you're supposed to do. But when you fully surrender it to God, it always works out.
Yeah, and God will, He is not hiding from you. He will reveal Himself to you.
Right.
Sometimes earlier for some people than for others. I know I sought Him hard and long. And then that Microsoft Word document, when it said, the Jesus that you've been taught about does not exist. Seek me further. And when I did, it was like He revealed Himself to me, but He's the one who started the whole thing from the beginning. All I'm doing is walking in it and being obedient to what I know He's prompting me to do next. So stay faithful, you guys. It is becoming more and more increasingly a secularized world. But your faith is so beautiful, and God will respond to you. He will give you direction. He is not hiding from you. And the worst thing that a Christian could ever say to somebody else is that you are not called, that your faith is less glistening, less beautiful. You're absolutely what God has ordained for you to be. If there's junk in your life, just trust me, get rid of it, and fall on your face before God and seek Him. He will communicate to you. If anybody would like to, and you feel comfortable to, we would love for you to share your own testimony to encourage others that might be reading the comments below. So please do so. Make sure that whatever you share is godly. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Donna Howell's show. It was a very, very unique and special episode, and I really enjoyed hearing your testimony, Brittney.
Thank you.
All right. We will see you next time. Stay tuned.